Bonjour, everyone. Welcome back to the NRW. I'm your host today, Rob Medina, and I thank you all very much for joining me here today because today I'm going to be reviewing the movie Monumental. Now, to give a bit of a backstory about this film, I actually intended on doing a review for this movie last year when I had one of the co-stars, the co-writer, and one of the producers in this movie, and Gary Kearns, who was on my show, You're So Cool with Rob Medina. I intended on doing a review for this film last year to announce about my interview with Gary that week on my show, and for some reason it slipped through the cracks. I don't remember what had happened that made me forget to do the review for this film, but it was strange because I remember thinking, oh, I meant to do this, and it slipped. At any rate, I was waiting for the right moment for me to get around into doing a review for this film, and I had the opportunity to do that here because I ended up having a conversation with one of his best friends and co-stars, co-writers in this movie, and one of the producers in the film, and Luke Albright, who I had a wonderful conversation with him on my show, which I'll be talking a little bit about later in this review. But with my conversation with Luke, his story that he shared about what had happened leading up to making this film really changed a lot of my perception on this movie. I already had a lot of opinions about the film, about what I liked about it and what I didn't like about it, but having him share one specific little nugget about getting the funds and having to make the film pretty much right away, that completely changed a lot in how I looked at the film. Not that I thought the movie was terrible, it's not the case at all, but I just had a perception about the film that I gathered that Gary was able to share about his experience in making the movie. But Luke's insight on the filmmaking process for Monumental really changed my perception. And so when I saw the movie again in anticipation for this review, I actually had a whole new set of appreciation. But I'm not going to lie, this is not a perfect movie by any means. There are a lot of issues with the film that I did have, but it mainly comes from a technical standpoint rather than the story and the characters, because the stories and the characters you get in this movie is quite good. It's really strong, actually. But when you learn about what it took to make the movie and how some of those technical aspects of the film didn't really work at all as well, which I'll be getting a little to in this review, it makes a lot more sense why things turned out the way that it did. But despite those flaws in the film, the movie is actually still really good. But I just know that this is not going to be a film that I would say, you guys should check it out. I think you're going to take a liking to the film because some people are going to look at the movie and see the technical flaws in it, and they're going to immediately dismiss the film, which I hope that with this review will give a different perspective on how to look at the film and respect the filmmakers behind this that were part of this movie and everyone else who had helped put the film together to make it turn out the way that it did. Because despite all those major hurdles that they all had gone through, they still got the film done and they got it out there, which is a miracle in its own right, which not a lot of people are able to accomplish. And these guys have been able to do that here. So a lot of props to both Gary, Luke, and everyone else involved in making this movie, because really the film turned out quite well in that respect. But I will get into a bit of spoilers in this review, because in order for me to really share my full-on thoughts about how I looked at the film in certain respects here, I will have to be getting some of that spoiler territory here. So if you've not seen the movie and don't want to be spoiled at all, I recommend you pause the video right now. You can check it out for free on Tubi, on Freevee, where it's available for you guys to check out. And if you don't care, let's continue on here, because I will get into the plot synopsis, my positives, my negatives, and then my rating. Two young men journey across the USA to honor one's mother by spreading her ashes at the monument she always dreamed of visiting. And that right there is the film in a nutshell. So now let's get into my positives. With my first positive with this movie, the characters in this film that we follow in the story, they're actually really good. I think in a lot of ways, they're very well written. The character's story is quite good. As I mentioned before in the plot synopsis, the purpose of this film is that Gary's character, and I'm terrible with his name, so forgive me if I forget the character's name here, but even though I've seen the movie more than once, but his character is really adamant about wanting to honor his mother's wish, who had this dream of visiting all these monuments across the United States, Hoover Dam, the Statue of Liberty, Liberty Bell, the Washington Monuments, and so on, all these different national landmarks all across the nation. And it was her dream to go visit all these landmarks. And in the movie, you get to see in it seems a flashback where she's talking to Gary's character and why these particular landmarks are very important in American history and how they develop the identity of America in a lot of ways as well too. So there's a lot of insight about her perspective and why it was so important for her to visit these natural landmarks across the country. But she unfortunately had passed away. I believe she may have had cancer, if I recall correctly. And so now that she has been cremated, he feels that because he wasn't a very good son to her throughout his life, we kind of get an idea of what it was about the relationship that he felt like it wasn't as strong as it should have been, and he felt a lot of regret for not being a good son to her, despite the fact that she's been a very good mother to him. He felt like it was his duty to honor his mother's wishes by spreading her ashes all across these natural landmarks in this country. And I actually found that to be a really beautiful story in that sense. And then we also have Luke's character, who is a troublemaker. He's kind of like a loose cannon, but yet because of his relationship that he has with Gary's character, who are not brothers in the story, but they pretty much are because they grew up together. And Gary's mother has pretty much raised both Luke and Gary pretty much their entire lives. So he has a lot of connection with her in that respect and looks at her like his own mother as well. So we get that investment with these characters, which I think is done rather well as far as the setup is concerned. But here's what I also want to point out too, is that there are some really wonderful character moments that you get to truly understand where each of these characters are coming from when it comes to their internal struggles that they're dealing with here. Luke's character is kind of a symmetry for a loose cannon, where he's not responsible. He's always getting into a lot of trouble, and people have always have to bail him out. And then you also get to see that despite him being very careless, he's starting to realize that these actions starting to catch up to him, that eventually people are going to get tired of it, including Gary's character. Where Gary's character, on the other hand, he has a lot of inner turmoil about how he has been very, I guess, dismissive about his relationship with his mother, and now that she's gone, he's starting to realize that he had it good with her, and he feels this massive regret and feels this obligation that he wants to fulfill his mother's wishes by honoring her. At least that's the best he could do to pay respects to her. So you understand that perspective as well too, from his point of view. And I think that with that introduction of those two characters, I think both guys have done a really good job in showcasing as far as what we're getting into here and understanding the character's journey along the way. And there are other things along the way too that you learn about Luke's character, where he hasn't seen his father in 27 years, and he finally has an opportunity to talk to him after over almost 3 decades, and excuse me, and have the chance to confront his father about where he's been, why did he abandon him, and you can see that he's really hurt by all this here, and he's also very confrontational as well too, and very, very cocky in a lot of ways, and you can see why Gary's character is, I would say he's fond of him, but is definitely very, he takes a liking to him and understands that this is the guy that always brings out the best in him to some degree. But lately, all these antics that Luke's character is putting up here, he's tired of it at that certain point. And there's even a point in the movie where Luke's character gets arrested when you come to find out that he's been driving on a suspended license. There's a warrant on him, and Gary's character has to find money to bail his friend out to finish out this wish and his and paying respect to his mother by spreading her ashes, but bringing him along too. So he felt that was very important to still have his friend tag along with him, despite the fact that he is furious at what he has done, and not telling him about the warrant that's out on him because of a bunch of things that had happened prior to the events of this movie here. So there's a lot of baggage of this film that each of these characters have, especially Luke's character, that I thought was really, really fascinating, that I thought they've done a really good job in showcasing here. Now, as far as the actual story in itself, where you're getting to see each of these characters going through all these major landmarks throughout the country here, I actually love that part of the movie too, because it's authentic. That the traveling that you're seeing in the film is what they were actually going through, and they are mingling with a lot of the locals, and they're in DC, they're up in New York, they're in Philadelphia, they're in parts of the Midwest as well too. So there's a number of different landmarks that I forget that we have in this country, and it's amazing that these guys have the ability to be able to pull this off here, because it's not an easy feat to accomplish here. And I believe they shot this movie in well under a month, I think 21 days or something to that effect here, if I recall correctly. But there was something unique about that film and being able to take on this arduous journey, and understanding that the RV was it's like basically their jaws. Like that RV they depended on to get from point A to point B, and it kept breaking down. And when you see that in the movie, it doesn't surprise me in a lot of ways if those actual breakdowns that occur in the film were very much what had occurred in real life at that moment there. So it's clearly obvious that a lot of it was infused into the story, but I'm not sure if it was already written that way, but it wouldn't surprise me if it wasn't, and it was added on later on. So there's just a lot of things about this movie that I truly did appreciate in that respect. Here's one thing I also want to point out too about the film, and this has to do with, it's going to be kind of weird because I'm going to get into my negatives about the flaws in this movie, but I'm going to point out the flaws now in the positives and how they were able to overcome that, because I think that's a major positive that I want to point out. When Luke had shared with me about how they were able to get funding for this movie, and because they were able to get funding for this film, they had to shoot this movie right away. So he had mentioned before that he wished they had the time to do a couple more passes on the script to make it a better written script, among other things as well, to fine tune a lot of details about the script so that they could tell a really good story, which they still have done. But when you see how the film was edited in certain sequences and you hear the audio, you can clearly tell that there's some clear ADR action going on there, where certain characters are speaking and some of the wording is not syncing up with the lip movements. And I understand that because there was an issue with the sound guy that wasn't really doing their job, according to what Gary was sharing with me, but to say it made sense. And despite those flaws in the film, quite frankly, I'm actually quite impressed they were able to get the job done, because I think, if I recall correctly, Gary had said about 95% of this entire film is all ADR, because none of the sound that they got from the actual suit ever made it, because the sound guy just didn't do their job. And I think that's quite an accomplishment with what they were able to pull off in that respect. And even when it comes to some of the editing choices they were making, I wasn't a big fan of it, especially when it came to certain transition from one scene to the next, and among other things as well too. Certain ways that some shots were set up here, I'm sure a lot of it had to do with timing, just being able to get the shot that they need at the best of their ability, and just, we need to get this right now and then move on to the next town, because we don't have much time left. So there's definitely a rush aspect about the film that I wouldn't blame it on them. It's just, that's just the nature of the shoot. And Gary ended up having to shoot Daylight's End right after shooting this movie, so clearly he had to get everything done on schedule here, so that way they have everything that they need and they can move on to the next project there. And he wasn't really in the best state, if I recall correctly. He was pretty much worn out from that shoot and having gone to another shoot in a really hot environment as well too, on top of that. So I've got to give everyone credit for doing their job and doing the best they can and making the film turn out the way that it did, because quite frankly, when I look at this movie, this is the type of film that you could show at a school to a lot of up-and-coming filmmakers, to point out a lot of the flaws and tell the stories that they had to go through in making the film, to give them a perspective about, these are going to be a lot of the hurdles you're going to have to go through. I mean, this is just our journey to what we went through, but we can, I would imagine that Gary and Luke can give some really insightful advice to help prepare these upcoming filmmakers of what to be dealing with when it comes to having to do things, on a tight budget, but also when someone says, here's the money, now shoot right now, or otherwise you got nothing. And then, holy shit, we gotta move like this. Come on, let's get going. That part of the story I found to be extremely fascinating, that it's something that you don't get to hear very often. And when people watch this movie, because I know there are gonna be a lot of people who watch this film and say, this movie looks awful, but I understand where they're coming from. But the movie in itself is actually quite good, despite the major flaws and hurdles they had to go through. But I truly believe that you got to give everyone here a huge amount of credit for what they were able to pull off here, because even though I have a lot of issue with this movie, mainly from the technical aspect of it here, it's still a good film regardless, despite all that there, because I've been able to understand and listen to the stories that both Gary and Luke have been able to share with me about what it took to make this film. I truly respect them as filmmakers, as screenwriters, as actors. And I mentioned before that this movie made me a Gary Kearns fan. There's a wonderful sequence in the movie where he has a moment with his mother who dies, and he's right there when it happens. And when you see what he was going through in that story about what he was having to deal with and having to overcome with this sense of guilt, and then when you see that moment in the film where his mother passes away, he's just breaking down. That is some stellar performance right there, where I remember thinking, like, this guy's fucking amazing. Like he's an incredible actor. And That performance right there made me a fan of him. And then when I started looking into his other films as well too, you can clearly see that this is a man who prepares, does his due diligence to do the character justice, to find something that he can connect with here, to tell an effective story with this character. And Luke Albright is another actor as well too, who has his way of doing things as well too. But there's something about Luke's performance as well too in that film that really made me respect him as an actor a lot more. But there's one movie that I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this here, that I thought he was amazing with his performance when we really get to showcase he got to showcase a lot more of his acting range in this movie called Stand, which I think is an incredibly well done movie. And considering that he literally got the script a week before he got to the set and having to learn everything on the spot, he did a phenomenal job with that movie. And it really impressed me how good of an actor he really is. And Luke Albright is one of those actors I think a lot of people should also look out for, along with Gary Kearns, because these guys are incredibly fucking amazing actors. So that right there is going to be into my positives. So now let's get into my negatives. Now, with the negatives, again, the negatives that I came across this movie, a lot of it has to do with the fact that they just did not have a lot of time to set up the shots. And I would imagine, I wouldn't say not to prepare for the role. I don't believe that's the case. It's hard for me to explain because I'm not, since I'm not an actor, I really can't come up with the terms and about what it is that I had issues with the performance. It wasn't that it was terrible. It was just that something about the setup and the execution of certain performances in the film seemed a little cheesy, to be truthful. Not that it was terrible, not that it was awful. There were certain moments in the film that definitely felt rather cheesy. But again, when I understand what they had to go through to make the film, and they want to have that emotional impact, they really did a good job in setting that up. Unfortunately, it was just the execution about how they were setting that up here that didn't work for me personally. I will also want to point out too, when it came to some of the sound design, when it came to this film, there were moments where I just thought it just didn't work well at all for me personally. But there are other aspects of the film that you get to have a moment with these characters to truly understand who they are. But when you have those moments, those isolated moments, it is beautiful. But then there's something else that happens along with that performance in that same scene that kind of takes away from me with my investment with that scene, because some of the other aspects of the technical aspects of the movie didn't sync up all that well for me to stay invested with that particular scene that I was watching. With the wonderful performance that both Gary and Luke and a lot of the other actors as well too do provide here, it seemed a little inconsistent, because the way everything was set up here, it was kind of almost all over the place, and you can tell they did the absolute best to try to make everything cohesive, to have a very what's the best way I could say, a very consistent rhythm about it. But it was kind of erratic in that respect. I hope it makes sense what I'm explaining here, because I'm not an actor, I'm not a director, I'm not an editor of film, of course, but there was some inconsistency about those technical aspects that kind of took away from my investment with certain scenes, with a lot of scenes, I should say, that didn't work for me all that well. And they were very glaring flaws for me personally, because of what they were having to put together with what little they had. And again, they did the best they could. And I'm not trying to be condescending or be patronizing by any way or shape or form, but it's obvious that those flaws were very glaring for me, that it was hard for me to be connected with the story in certain times of the film, because that wonderful moment in the movie where Gary is with his mother, he's breaking down, like I was invested with that scene. There are other moments in the movie too where you get some beautiful shots of some of these wonderful landmarks you get here in this country that they were done very well. In fact, they were done really well. And I remember thinking, like, how are they able to get those shots? But when it came to some of the other personal times you get with the characters, that it just didn't work all that well for me personally. Even though the setup, the story and what you're getting of these moments with these characters is rather good, just other aspects about how it was all put together didn't come out all that well for me. I know I'm kind of rambling on here, but I think you may understand where I'm coming from. But really, I mean, there's some other things about the movie too that I kind of had issues with here, but you know, I don't think I'm going to do the film justice by keep pointing it out there in that regard, because I don't want to come off as if though I'm trying to bag on the movie because of those flaws there. But that was really the major point that I had, the major issue that I had with the film, was just those glaring technical flaws that really kind of took me out of film from time to time. Not always, but it did happen quite often. So, but oddly enough for me, the positives in this film do outweigh the negatives, but the negatives in this movie are really just from the technical aspect of it here. But quite frankly, I still did enjoy the movie despite those flaws in the film, but that's going to be the end of my negatives here. So now let's get into my rating. This is a film that I believe that whoever comes across it, if they actually sit through the film from start to finish, they actually may really like the story quite a lot, because this is a very strong story. Unfortunately, a lot of those technical flaws in the film do sort of hold the film back quite a lot for me personally. But when I go back and watch the movie, I'm still invested with the story, other than certain sequences here and there, as I mentioned before, because of the technical flaws. But there's something about this film that I truly respect about it, especially when I've heard the stories that both Luke and Gary have shared with me about what it took to make this film, because it wasn't an easy process at all. I mean, there was times they had to spend money out of their own pocket to make this movie. And there was also a lot of other hurdles along the way that they had to deal with in preparation to get the shots that they needed, and didn't work out as well as they thought it was going to work out. And they still made the best, they did the best they could despite those setbacks. So I got to give them a lot of props for that. So for me, because I think the story is really good and the performances in this film are actually quite good, and despite the hurdles they had to go through, this movie turned out quite well. Technically not very well in my opinion, but story-wise, acting-wise, among other things as well, it turned out quite good. So for me, I would say this movie is a raise a glass. If you have seen the movie, let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. The movie is available for free on Tubi and on Freevee, so I recommend you guys do check it out. I would love to hear your opinions about how you felt about the film, if you really liked the story, or if you didn't like the film. I still would like to hear your thoughts on the movie in the comment section down below. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you subscribe to the channel, make sure you share, like the videos, and hit the notification bell while you're down there. Follow us on our social media accounts on Instagram, New Release Wednesdays, on Facebook, Nerds Rule the World, and on Twitter at the NRW. And you can follow me on my social media accounts on Instagram and Twitter, Mr. Rob Medina, and on Facebook, simply just Rob Medina. And I have a show on the channel called You're So Cool with Rob Medina, and my guest this week is the co-star, co-writer, and producer of the movie, and Luke Albright. Luke is one of those guys that I really learned a lot from in my conversation with him, and I think this is someone that you all should keep an eye out for, because he has provided some really unique insight about his perspective about what he has learned about himself while working in the entertainment industry, that he felt like has made him a better person, how to conduct himself in the business side of the industry, along with some of the more personal aspect of it as well too, when it comes to his preparation for a character, among other things as well too, especially with the relationships that he's been able to develop while working in the entertainment industry. So he's someone I really am excited to see what he's gonna be doing down the pipeline here, because I'm a fan of him as an actor, but I'm also a fan of him as a person as well, because from my conversation with him, I really do believe that there's some really wonderful insight that he can share that I think a lot of people can take away from. So be on the lookout for that episode be dropping this week on Friday here on the NRW for you guys to check out, which I'm excited for you guys to see here. But I also have a show, I meant to say a social media account for the show as well too, on Instagram, You're So Cool with Rob Medina, on Twitter, You're So Cool WRM. And I want to thank you all very much for checking out this review. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Until next time, stay safe out there, and cheers.